Hey class, in this video we're going to be going over how to add a dialogue system into the game for conversations between NPCs and the player, or different NPCs, or just some dialogue that you might want to have in cutscenes between your game scenes. We're going to use an add-on called Dialogic. So there's a lot of different add-ons for Godot, so we'll go over how to add the add-on into your scene and how it works, and we'll use Dialogic to create a sample dialogue between an NPC and the player. So there's a few things that we have to do. We're going to go over downloading a font. We're going to download Dialogic. We're going to set up our scene a little bit. Then we're actually going to create an NPC scene. So we'll have the NPC art, and then we'll trigger the dialogue between the player and the NPC. We're going to create our Dialogic dialogue to be triggered, and then we're also going to connect the dialogue to our main script so that we can communicate between the two. Then once we've got all that set up, we'll do a little documentation, post on the Open Lab, and that'll be it. You can see the scripts that are being used here. There are a bunch of different options that I go over in the video. So you should definitely pay attention in the video as I'm talking about which part of the scripts you may want to skip or you may want to use or not use. But these are kind of the basics to get you started. So let's get started. All right, to get started, we can use the developer default folder, or we can use a game that we're already working on. So I'm going to go to my MMP 270 folder and go to developer. I'm just going to continue working with the developer default. There's some new assets related to this lab that may not be in the folder. So if you don't have those, you may need to go to the assets folder or re-download the developer default. But I'm also going to go over how to create a lot of stuff from scratch. So you may not need that. You are going to need some art. So if you don't see that in the sprites folder, then you can download the assets folder and get the art from there. We need a couple things to get started before we get into Godot. One thing that we want to get is a nice font to use. There's a lot of different options for this. You could use Google Fonts, you could use other web-based font places. I'm going to check out Bit Font Maker. So you could actually make a font if you want, which is pretty cool, but you can also just download Creative Commons license fonts from the gallery. So I'm just going to download one here. You can see the most popular fonts here, and I want to use something other than the Godot default font because it's pretty boring. We want to use something that kind of looks like our game. So just looking at these popular ones, the Adventurer font actually looks really good for an RPG style game. So I'm going to go ahead and click download and click OK. So that's going to go into my downloads folder. So let's open up the downloads folder, and we can just drag that into our fonts folder. So you could look through more fonts, or you could create your own font, or you could use another font place as well. We're also going to use an add-on called Dialogic. We're going to download it within Godot, but I do want to go check out the website for Dialogic because we can see the code here. It is an open source project, so there are going to be some bugs, and it's good to be able to look at the source code to see, if you find a bug that you want to report, or maybe there's a build that's coming out that's going to fix that bug. It's good to be aware of that. There's also a website for the plugin that has some documentation that explains how to use the plugin and other things like that. So it's a useful resource to be aware of, but we're actually going to download it directly from Godot. So let's get started. Let's open up our project. So let's set up a couple things before we get started with our dialogue system. So I'm going to go to scenes, and I'm going to go to the default simple scene. And so this is already set up with a bunch of stuff that I want to use, including the scene manager, which has the scene manager script, which we're going to have to update a little bit. There's also my UI, which I want to be able to use, and my metrics. And there's also some items, which I'm going to be using in this lab as well. So this was set up from another lab, the collecting items lab. And so I'm going to make a copy of this just so I don't overwrite it. So I'm going to duplicate this scene. And let's just call this NPC scene. And so this is just kind of a test scene to test out our NPC. So now we need an NPC to drop into this scene. And I'm just going to hide the game over. And so let's add our NPC first, and then we will set up our dialogue system. So I'm going to go into my scenes folder and click new scene. And I'm just going to call this NPC. And we're going to create an area 2D. And so we need a collision area so that we know when the player enters the area of the NPC, so we can trigger the dialogue between the player and the NPC. This isn't the only way you could set this up. You could have a whole scene that is nothing but just some dialogue, and it's pretty easy to set up the code for that. But I figure for our games, we're probably going to want to be able to interact with other characters in the scene as well. So we're just going to set this up as a demo. So I've got my area 2D, and so we can get started building our NPC. Let's rename this NPC, and let's add in an animated sprite. So we're just going to build our animations very quickly. And then we're also going to add in a collision shape 2D. Of course, we need to have our collision set up. So let's do our animated sprite first. I'm going to add some new sprite frames. I'm just going to go through this really quickly because we've done this a bunch. So I'm going to delete the default animation. I'm going to create an idle animation, and I'm going to create a talking animation called talk. So let's go to the idle, switch this back to idle, and set playing on. And I'm going to click on my little waffle button, go to my sprites, and I'm going to find my NPC idle animation. So if you don't have the art for this, you should download it from the assets folder, or you might want to collaborate with another student, or you can do the art lab and create the art on your own. So this has 3 frames in it. I'm just going to go to 2 horizontal, 2 vertical, select my 3 frames. And I'm just going to make a quick animation here because he's kind of doing a lot of stuff. So I'm just going to copy and paste a few versions of this one, and let's put the blink at the end and put the wave in the middle. So our NPC blinks and he waves. So just a little idle animation to let the player know that this guy is alive. And now let's add an area here. So I'm gonna add a nice big circle. And for this one, I'm gonna make it much larger than the area of the actual art, because this is what's gonna trigger the NPC to know that we can start actually doing our dialogue. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And now we can create our script for our NPC. So the scene itself is actually really, really simple. So let's go to our NPC area 2D. And the first thing we want to do is set up our collision layers. So we always want to make sure to do this. So we don't actually have an NPC layer. So let's go ahead and add one. So we'll go to project, project settings, scroll down to layer names and go to 2D physics. And we'll just add NPC into the last layer. And so now we're going to have to refresh this. So I'm going to click out and go back. And now we can see NPC here. And so we want it to be on the NPC layer. And we only need to interact with the player. So I'm only going to add the player layer to our mask. And so that's pretty simple. I'm going to save that. And now let's go ahead and add our script. So I'm going to go to the script, click new script. I'm going to make sure to choose the scripts folder. I'm going to call this NPC. And that looks pretty good. And so I'm going to click create. And let's close some of our other scripts that we are not going to be using. We will use the scene manager later, so I'll leave that open. So the first thing that we need to do is let the NPC know which dialogue it's going to be using. So let's create an export variable called dialogue name. And so when we create our dialogues, we're going to give them names, and so we can reference them using this string. And I'm just going to give a default here, dialogue name, and we'll fill that in once we create some dialogue in the future. And we are going to kind of be moving back and forth between our code and our dialogue because we're going to be making some updates and then looking at what things look like. We also need a reference to our player, but we're going to get this from an event. So I'm just going to say variable player equals null. And I'll explain why we need that later. And we also need a reference to our dialogue. So when I say something is null, that means that we're going to have to reference it in multiple functions, but we don't actually know what it is yet. We're going to assign it once the player arrives inside the dialogue. And so we don't know what it is yet, but we are going to assign it. And then we also need to use it in multiple functions. So we need to be able to reference it in different places. So remember, this area up here is our global variables. So they're not global like our global script, but they're global to this script itself. And so that means it's available to all the functions inside of this script. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to have a couple of different events for when the player enters the area of the NPC and when the player leaves. So I'm going to go back to my NPC, go to the node, and I'm going to choose body entered and double click and click connect. When player enters NPC area. So we need that. And then we also are going to need when the player leaves so we can remove the dialogue. So I'm going to connect this and say, when player leaves. All right, so let's set up our dialogue and then we'll come back to this. To actually get started with Dialogic, which is the add-on we're going to use, we're going to go over to this tab, the asset library. And this is really cool. Basically, we can see a lot of different assets that are designed for Godot. So they're all open source, they're all free to use. We may need to give attribution and different things like that, but we can use all of them for our projects without having to pay for them. And so we can search for Dialogic. I'm just going to type in Dialog. And what you'll see is it actually shows there's a few different add-ons that do dialogue systems. Dialogic is just one of those. There's probably other systems that are equally as useful, and you might have different contexts where different ones are more useful than another. I like Dialogic because it's pretty simple. It has a really good interface and it does everything that I needed to do. There are a couple bugs, but there's a pretty good user base of people who have made tutorials about them and things like that. So that's one of the really nice things about add-ons in Godot. And there's also other ecosystems like Unity, where you have things like the asset library. And what this does is it basically just gives us a lot of code to do things that happen in a lot of different games. So most of what we've been doing so far is just writing our own code to do certain things. And that's useful because we can learn how things work. But in a lot of cases, the thing that we want to do is actually really complicated, and learning to write all that code might take too long. And so in that case, it can be easier to download a add-on and use the code that somebody else created to implement something in your game. So that way we're not bound by our own programming skills or our own knowledge. We can just use add-ons and other things to build out the game that we want to make. So to install, it's pretty easy. I'm just going to click on this plugin and I'm going to click download. And that's going to download. I'm going to click install, and it's going to install this into my folders. So now that it's installed, I'm going to click OK. And if we go back to our file system, you can see there's an add-ons folder and there's Dialogic. And there's a bunch of stuff in here. If we look at one of the scripts, you can see it pretty much looks like any other script that we've written in class, but it's written by somebody else and they made it available for us to use. So we're going to close that up. The last thing that we need to do is go to project settings, and go to plugins and just click enable. Otherwise we won't see this. So once I click enable, notice that Dialogic appear in my menu at the top. And so now I can go over to Dialogic and start building out a dialogue. So that's pretty cool. It's pretty easy. Now we can build out this dialogue mostly just by pointing and clicking. We are going to have to add a little bit of code to start the dialogue, but we can get started just building our dialogue. So there's a few different components to creating a dialogue. The first one that we want to add is our characters. So we can go to characters, or we can click plus new character. And let's give this character a name. So let's call this our main character. So you might have a name for your main character. You can put their name in there. You could have a different display name if you want, or you could have a nickname so that other characters can refer to you by your nickname. There's some cool options there. And then we can choose a color to associate with our character. So our character is kind of pink, so maybe I'll choose a pink color. And now here's where we're going to add our portraits or expressions. And so we have a default expression, and that's where we're going to add in the art for our character portraits. So if I click on here and go to sprites, so this is my main character. So I want to go to character portraits and just click on a character. And so that's the default. That looks pretty good. I can also match this color if I want to match it. And then I can add more portraits for more expressions. So let's add this one. This is maybe like sad. And let's add another portrait. This is happy. So you can add as many of these as you want, and then you can trigger them at different points in your dialogue. So let's add our second character, and then we'll create our first timeline. So I'm going to go to characters, click plus again. And so this is going to be our NPC. I'm going to give this NPC a name. I'm going to call the NPC Jerry, and I'll give it a color. Well, actually, let's get the art before we do that. So for our NPC art, let's go back to our sprites folder, go to NPC portraits, and here's our default art. So let's match our color to our art. So that looks pretty good. And then we can add a couple more portraits. So maybe this is exclaiming. We can use different expressions that might match what's happening in the scene. Okay, this could be confusion. Doesn't really matter here because you can choose whatever you want. So it's really just a label. Maybe this is just talking. So we have a couple characters that will kind of appear in our dialogue. So then now let's go to timelines, and see these are the kind of like main components where we actually sort out all of the dialogue in the scene. So I'm going to click for a new timeline, and I'm going to call this Jerry intro. And so this is just a timeline where we're going to meet this NPC Jerry. And so the dialogue has a bunch of different nodes. You can see all of the nodes over here. And if you hover over these, it'll tell you what they are. And so there's a few different types of rules that we kind of have to follow. So I'm going to go over most of these nodes. I'm not going to go over all of them, but the first thing that we need to do is actually add our characters to the scene. So I'm going to add in Jerry, and we can say where they appear kind of in our scene, and we'll see what that looks like in a second. And so then let's add in our main character, and we'll put them in the next position over here. And you can add other characters to the dialogue. So you might have multiple NPCs that are all talking to each other. The next thing that we can do is just add a text node. And so we can choose a character. So let's choose the main character, and we can do our default expression. And he can just say, hello, who are you? And then we can have Jerry respond. So this one's Jerry. And they might exclaim, hi, I'm Jerry. And then we can actually go to a question. So in this case, we have a structure where we actually have like a dialogue, and then there can be different answers with different results. So let's add this in, and then we're going to set up the rest of our code, and then we'll come back and build out a little more of our dialogue. So for this one, we'll say Jerry, and we'll have him saying this, and he'll say, how is your day going? And then we can have a couple choices. So we can say good or bad. So this is the character, this is us actually choosing. And then each choice, we can give a different response from Jerry. So we'll say Jerry, and he can exclaim, or we can have Jerry and he can talk. And so if we say good, he'll say, that's cool. And if we say bad, he can say, that's too bad. You know, not an actually very interesting conversation here, but just kind of showing how the functionality works and how we can create these different decision trees within our dialogue. And we can go even further. So we can keep going here. We can have more choices. We can save this choice as a variable and then set future choices based on what they say here. So we can actually do a lot of complicated stuff by using these dialogue trees. All right, so this looks pretty good. We have a very simple little tree here, and I think that's enough to actually put our NPC in our scene and start the dialogue. So let's go back to our NPC scene, and what we're gonna do is just put this guy inside of our scene, and then we're gonna trigger the dialogue by walking up to the character. So let's go back to our NPC scene, and we are going to use these items in a second. So let's put the NPC somewhere over here. So I'm going to go to the default simple scene and add a new node, 2D, and I'll call this NPCs in case we have more in the future. And then I'm going to click the link button and grab my NPC scene and click open. And then let's move the NPC over here. So for now, we're just going to immediately trigger the dialogue when the player enters the NPC area. So let's go back to our NPC scene. When we enter the body, we want to start our Dialogic scene. So I'm just going to remove this pass and leave the comment here and go to the next line. And so the way that I start a Dialogic scene is just by saying dialogic.start and then the name of the scene that I want to start. So I'm going to put in dialogue_name here. And we can fill that in with our NPC. Then I need to actually add the dialogue scene into my current scene. So what I want to do is assign the result of this dialogic.start to my dialogue variable that I have up here. So I'm going to say dialogue equals, and then I'm going to add that into the scene. So I can just say add child dialogue. The add child is just a Godot method that takes that scene and puts it into our main scene hierarchy. When the player leaves the scene, we want to remove the dialogue. So I'm going to say remove child dialogue. And this is kind of a simple way to do it. I could actually do something where I trigger the dialogue to end itself, but I'm just going to kind of do a simple version here, and we're going to add a little bit more to this in a second. So let's test this out, and then we'll try a couple things. So I'm going to go back to my NPC scene and click on my NPC, and then I have to get my dialogue name here. So in case you forgot, just go back to Dialogic, go to timelines. We're going to use the Jerry intro scene. So I'm going to copy that, and then I'm just going to paste it into my dialogue name. So now we can test this out. And so the dialog should appear. Whoops, looks like my player has the wrong script. And so it looks like I only have my player controller script and I need the simple player script. So I'm gonna go back to my assets folder. So I'm gonna go over to the Finder and I have the assets folder here. If you don't have it, just go and download it from the page. And I'm gonna go into scripts and here we have player controller simple. So I'm gonna copy that and then go back to developer default, scripts, and paste that in there. So now I can load my player simple script. And this is for, a scene where the player can just walk around in all directions. There's no gravity and jumping and stuff like that. So that's more appropriate for the scene that we're in. Although you could add NPCs into a platform scene where you are jumping around. There's no reason that you can't do that. So let's see if we can trigger our dialogue. And there we go. So when we enter the scene, you see the main character dialogue, the main character saying, hello, how are you? And then it's already set up to work with some of the default Godot UI buttons. So if I hit enter, then we go to our NPC. Hi, I'm Jerry. And he says, how's your day going? And then I can either use the arrows to go up or down. And you can see my player is moving. So we might want to change that so they don't move during the dialogue, but I can just say good. And he says, that's cool. And that's the end of my dialogue. So there's a few things that we want to add in here to make this a little bit more of a interesting experience, but this is kind of like the basic setup. And so we're going to add a few things here, but really beyond this, none of these things are required. These are kind of optional. So I'm going to go back to my main scene. I'm going to increase the speed of my player a little bit to help with testing. And I'm going to move my NPC back over here so I don't have to walk as far every time. So I'm just going to test a few things out. So I'm going to go back to the NPC scene. I'm actually going to make this collision shape a little bit smaller. I think it was kind of abrupt. One thing is we're going to want to change the style of the dialogue. We saw that had the default style, but we can make our own styles. And one thing I want to do is add a font. One thing I've noticed is that Dialogic doesn't really work well with fonts unless we've already created fonts. And so why don't we make a label for our character so he can sort of, instead of immediately launching the dialogue, we can have an interaction with the player first. So what we'll do instead is we will have a label and we'll show that label when the player enters the area. And if the player hits a certain button, then we'll continue with the dialogue. So if we go into project settings and go to our input map, notice that UI accept is already mapped to enter. And so we can basically use that. We don't have to make our own button, but you could make your own button here, or you could remap it to space or something else. So we're just going to use the UI accept. There's also UI select and UI cancel. So Godot has some built-in stuff here that we can take advantage of for our UI. So let's go to our MPC. And what we're going to do is add a label. So this is actually a UI node, but we can add it into our 2D node. So let's take this label and we'll just move it above the NPC. And I'm just going to put some text in here. I'm going to say hi, or let's say enter to speak to Jerry. And let's see, I'm going to center this. And so now we can create our own font for this. And so we're going to create a font and then save that font so that we can use it in Dialogic. And if you don't want to have this label, you can just delete it after that. But we do need this to actually get our font to work, at least from what I've been able to discover. So let's go to our custom fonts over here and we'll click on font and we're going to make a new dynamic font. And then we are going to click on the dynamic font. That's going to open up some more settings. And one thing that's a little tricky here is that when you create this dynamic font, the size is going to be the same no matter where we use it. So if we want to have fonts of different sizes, we're actually going to have to do this process more than once. So I'll go to the font and I'll go to font data and click new dynamic font data and then choose my font path, which is in my fonts. I have this adventurer font. So there are a bunch of steps here. It's a little tricky, but now we have the font and it disappeared probably because there's not enough space. I'm not really sure where it is, but let's try changing some of the settings. So let's make the font maybe a little smaller. Okay, so it was a little too big. So let's make this font box larger. And then let's increase the size a bit. Okay, so 24 is probably too big. Let's try 20. I think that's going to be good. But if you notice, it's a little blurry, and we can fix that if we go back into our font and we can just turn off anti-aliased. And then when we change the size, now it looks a little bit better. So I think 20 is a good size. We'll see how that looks in our dialogue, but I think I'm just going to try that. So now I'm going to save this font, and I'm going to put the size in the font name so I remember what size it is. If I want to create other sizes later, I'll have to come back and go through this process again. So it's a little tricky, but I think it's worth it to have a cool font that's not the default font. So I'll go back to my dynamic font and click save. And I'm going to say Dialog 20. So 20 is the font size here. And I'm going to make sure to put this in my fonts folder so it's easy to find. And I'm going to click save. And so I think that looks pretty good. I can still change the color of this using the visibility if I want to, but I'm going to leave that as white for now. You can also do things like add an outline or other things like that if the font is too hard to read as one color. So next thing we have to do is set up this label so it's not always there in the scene. So then we'll go back to our NPC script, and I'm just going to make the label invisible to start. So I'm going to say func _ ready. And I'm going to use my $ and get label and just say .visible = false. So that will turn off the label. So then if we enter the NPC body, we will turn on the label. And then at this point, we're going to have to add some different code to make sure that the player has hit a button in order to capture the dialogue. So we're going to need a couple new variables to track this. So let's add a new variable for player entered, and we'll set that to false. So now we have our player entered. So when we enter the NPC, we'll say player entered = true. And now we're going to add in a process function. So process is kind of like our physics process. We don't actually need to know the time here, but we're just going to be looking for input. So when we're looking for input, we can't just do it once, like in an event. We have to do it for multiple frames. So what we're going to do is say if player entered, then we can say input.isAction just pressed. So we don't want to use pressed because then it'll keep triggering. We just want to use just pressed. And what we're going to do here is our UI accept. And so if the player hits enter, then we are going to start the dialogue. So now I'm going to put my Dialogic code in here. And we can still say when we leave the body, we're going to remove the dialogue, and we'll also say player entered = false so that we won't be looking for this. So let's give that a try. I'm going to go back to my NPC scene and hit play. And I'm getting an error here. I'm not exactly sure what this error is. Oh, and I see. So I have an error here because I forgot to say if. So I need to actually put this inside of a conditional. Okay, so let's try that again. I'm going to try the scene. And so now we don't see the label. Oh, and I forgot to turn the label on. Okay. So if we enter, oh, and I forgot to make this true. So label visible should be true. And when we leave, we want to have label visible is false. Whoops. So you don't need the label. You can just automatically trigger the dialogue, but it might be kind of nice just to add another layer to that interaction. So I'm going to hit enter. And so now the dialogue starts, and I can hit enter and go through my dialogue. So you may have noticed that I have a little glitch here, and that's because I am hitting enter and this process is going over. So let's add another variable to say dialogue started = false. And so if we start the dialogue, we need to say dialogue started = true. And then we can say if player entered and not dialogue started. So that way we're not constantly looking for that enter. So it is a little bit tricky. You can see I'm starting to get a lot of variables here, but when you're managing these kinds of interactions, there are a few different things that you have to watch out for. So if we exit, let's also say dialogue started also = false. So it's getting a little more complicated, but again, you don't actually need this. If you want to skip this whole thing, you can just use the simpler version where you trigger the dialogue as soon as you get to the NPC. So let's try this out now. So I hit enter and we get our dialogue, and there we go. I guess we also want to remove the label. So if we start our dialogue, let's say set our label to false. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we kind of have to do to make this interaction work. But I think that's a pretty typical interaction, so let's kind of leave that as it is. All right, so now let's go back to Dialogic and style our dialogue a little bit. So we have a nice font to use now. So if I go to my default theme, you can see that this is what up here is a preview of what our dialogue is looking like. And there's a lot of interesting stuff you can do here. It's showing you that you can add some effects and do different stuff, but I'm just gonna keep things simple. I'm gonna add a new font, and I'm gonna change the style of the box a little bit. So I'm gonna go to the font and choose my Dialog20.tres, and I'm gonna click open. And so now you can see the font being used in the text. It is a little bit small. So as I mentioned, we may need to go create a larger font. We can test that and then see how it looks. So there's also a different font for bold and italic. If I want to use those, I can do that, but I'm just gonna fill in my Dialog 20 for all of those. And then I can change the text color if I want to. I can change the animation. There's a bunch of different settings that I can play with here. Now I'm gonna go to the dialog box. They have this kind of angled, cool looking dialog box, but I don't really want that. It doesn't really fit the aesthetic of my game. So I'm gonna get rid of that, and I'm just gonna use a background color. And I could change the background color if I want. Maybe I'll make it not completely black. Maybe I'll make it like sort of dark gray. So that maybe looks a little better. And everything else in here looks good. The next thing that we can do is change this blue arrow for the next indicator. So if I want to change that, I can go into my sprites, and I made this little dialogue arrow. So you can see it now. It's not perfect, but it fits the style of my game more. So I'm just going to leave that there. You also have some options with the animation. So once you see that, you can change different things. I like the up and down. It's pretty nice. I'm just going to leave it like that. So next I'm going to go to the name label, and I'm going to choose the font. So I'm going to go back to my fonts, choose Dialog 20 again. And so you can see it's still small for the name as well. So we are going to have to make a larger font, but we'll do that in a second. And then there's a bunch of other options for buttons and audio and other things that we can add in here. But I think these are enough options to get us started. Let's go make our other font. So I'm going to go back to my NPC. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to duplicate my label, and I'm just going to make a larger font here. So I'm going to go down to my custom fonts and open up my font area and go to new dynamic font. So I kind of have to go through this whole process again, but we're just going to make this a little bigger. So click on my dynamic font, go to new dynamic font data, click on that, go to my font path, go to fonts, choose adventurer, and click anti-aliased. And now let's go to settings, and let's make this a lot bigger. 20 was like way too small. I'm a little worried that 40 is going to be way too big, but let's just try it. Let's save it. I'm going to save this as, let's go back to fonts, and I'm going to save this as Dialog 40 and click save. And then I'll just delete this label. Okay, so now I'll go back to Dialogic and try my Dialog 40. And that looks a lot better. So it's much bigger. It's still not huge, so we can see how it looks in the game, but I think this will be better. So yeah, it is a little tricky with the font. You can't actually change the font size in the Dialogic editor. You have to actually build these fonts. So that's the one kind of tedious aspect of this. So let's take a look at the style. So I'm going to play the scene. And so let's go say hi to this NPC, and we'll hit enter. And so now we have the nice font, we have a different background, and we can see our characters. So we say, hello, who are you? And he says, hi, I'm Jerry. You can see that the characters are actually blocked by the box. So that's probably why they had a transparent box. So we could try to change that in a second. And he says, hi, I'm Jerry. And he says, how's your day going? And then we can move up or down, or we can click good or bad. So let's say good. And he says, that's cool. And we hit enter. And that's the end of our dialogue. So let's try making our dialog box. We can just change the alpha here. So now it'll be a little bit see-through so we can see our characters behind it. So I think that will look a little better. And we can obviously continue to adjust that. You can also change the position and size and do lots of other things, but I'm not gonna go through too many of those in this video. So the next thing that I wanna do is actually play some animations. And so you don't really have to do this. It's kind of up to you, but right now the player and the NPC just kind of continues standing there. So if we want to play some animations, we can do that in our NPC script as well. We'll actually use our NPC script and adjust the player script a little bit. So once the dialogue gets started, let's choose the animated sprite in our NPC and we'll play the talk animation. So then we can also do that with the player. And so we know the player here, we get this body here, so we can say player equals body. And now when we go here, we can say player.talk. And we'll just set that to a function inside the player controller that plays the player animations. Let's go to our player and click on our player controller simple. And so we don't want our player moving around while we're talking. So I'm gonna add in an isMoving variable and we'll set this to true to begin. You might remember this from the other video we did where I added in a isMoving variable so we can just prevent these animations from happening if the player is moving. So I'll say if the velocity is greater than length squared and is moving, and then we can say else if is moving. So that way we can turn is moving off if we want the player to talk. So let's add a new function in the player controller simple. You could add this into the regular player controller as well if you're using a platformer scene. So we'll say function talk, and we'll say animated sprite dot play talk. And I don't know if I added this animation already, so we'll take a look and then we'll just say is moving equals false. And then we're also gonna have a function to stop the animation. So let's call this move. And so we'll just say is moving equals true. So that way, when they're done with the conversation, you know, the dialogue, they can go back to moving. And let's make sure that my player actually has a talking animation. So I'll go to the player, go to animated sprite. There's no talking animation, so I'm gonna add a new animation and call it talk. And then I'll add the animation. I'm pretty sure I made this when I made my player. So let's go to sprites and I have a player talk. So I'll click open. It's 5 frames, so it's 2 horizontal, 3 vertical. And so let's just add that. And that's a little fast, so maybe we'll do 3 FPS. And so that looks pretty good. So now if we go back to our NPC script, so we can start the player talking, and then if the player leaves, we can simply change the dialogue back to idle. But there's multiple cases in which we may want this to happen, like if the dialogue just ends through the dialogue system, or if the player leaves the scene. So let's say func end dialogue. So let's make a specific function to end the dialogue. And so here we'll take our animated sprite for our NPC and we'll play idle. And then we'll take our player and we'll say .move. So we'll go back to our regular animations. So let's test this out. So if I walk up here and I hit enter, we're gonna start talking. My NPC disappeared, so maybe I didn't set up their talk animation correctly. So let's take a look. Animated sprite dot talk, animated sprite talk. Okay, looks like I lost my talk animation at some point, so let's just add it back in. Not really sure what happened there, but we can just choose these frames. And let's take a look at that. Okay, so let's make it a little slower. And then we'll go back to the idle animation. So I'm not really sure what happened there, but we can just add that in real quick. And so now if we go up here and hit enter, so now we can see they're talking down here and we can see them talking here. So one thing is that the players keep talking once the dialogue is done. So what we're gonna need to do is add some signals to handle the end of the dialogue. So let's go back to our NPC script. And so what we can do is connect a signal for when the timeline ends. And this is just a default thing that Dialogic does for us. So after we create the dialog, we can say dialog.connect, and we'll connect the timeline end signal. And we're going to use self here to refer to the script that we're already in. And then we're going to name the function that we want to call, which is just end dialog, that function that we already created. Okay, so this should call the end dialog function. So let's try that. And so when I go up here and I click through my dialog, you're going to notice that they still keep talking. The dialog that function doesn't get triggered. And this is something that's a little tricky, which is that we're not getting any warnings about this or anything like that, but this end dialog function is expecting a parameter. So a signal usually has some type of parameter, and we're not getting a parameter, so the function's not working. So what we can do here is just put underscore param. You can actually put whatever you want there. It's sort of like our underscore delta. It just makes the function work because it's expecting something to be here. We don't actually need this parameter, but we do need it to be there for the function to work. So that's just a little thing that can be a little tricky. So I wanted to show that in case you forgot that step or something like that, you'll see what the issue was. So now they go back to their idle state. One more thing we can do, again, this is optional. You don't really have to do all of this stuff, but I want to go over a bunch of different things that are possible with our Dialogic. So one thing that we can do is actually have the dialog dependent on different parameters in our scene. And remember, we have our global script that has things like our item count, and we can collect the apples to increase our item count. So one thing that you might want to have in a dialogue with an NPC is some exchange of resources. So the NPC could say, I'll sell you this for that. And then we could say, if we have enough, then we can test that. So one thing that we have to do is we actually have to put the data into the Dialogic scene. It doesn't have access to the data directly. And the way to do that, we go over to Dialogic, and there's this thing called definitions. And so we can add values to our definitions. So let's add a value in here called apple count, and we'll set the value to 0 by default. So now we have this definition, and we can make decisions in our dialog based on that definition. However, we have to give the current value of the count when we start the dialog. So let's go back to our script. And once we start the dialog, let's also say Dialogic. So we're using the main Dialogic global function here, that set value or set variable. And so we're going to set the apple count variable. I'm just kind of using item count and apple count. It doesn't really matter as long as you know which one is which. And that's actually global.item count. So that's going to set that value to whatever the current item count of the player is. So then we can make a choice about that. And then we can also send a signal back to our script to update that count, depending on what we do with that. So now let's go back to Dialogic and go back to our main timeline. So after we've kind of introduced ourselves, let's go to the end of this question. And so now we can have a new dialogue based on a condition. So we can say, we can have a question, and we can have Jerry ask, would you like to buy a fireball for 2 apples? So in the projectile lab, we go over how to use projectiles, and we have these fireballs. And so the idea here is kind of that you could get a fireball from an NPC and then use it. We're not going to implement the whole thing, but we're just going to show how to use one condition, and then you could add more to it if you want to. So the player can either say yes or no. So we have choice for yes and a choice for no. And if the choice is no, then we'll just say, we'll just drag this text down here and say, okay. And, that's the end of that conversation. So if our choice is yes, then we have to test whether the player has enough apples to actually buy the fireball. So we're going to put an if here. This is sort of like an if in our regular code, but now it's in this kind of visual code that is set up by Dialogic. So we're going to select the definition, apple count. So if it's equal to or greater than 2, then we can purchase the apples. So we'll say, here you go, 1 fireball. And then we're gonna want to tell our main program that the player got a fireball. So what we'll do is we'll add a signal here back to Godot. So we'll do a signal. You can also do things like call a method from a node. And so the signal we'll add is add fireball. But we also need to remove an apple. So we're gonna add another signal. Whoops, this came down here for some reason, called remove apple. And then we could either have it default to 2 or we can just do it twice. So either one is fine. I'm gonna be kind of lazy here and just do it twice. So I'm gonna go remove apple again. If you have a more complicated setup with lots of different resources and stuff like that, you're probably gonna wanna make more definitions and have ways of saving this. And if that's something that you wanna do, we could go over an approach for that. I'm just gonna kind of keep things simple just to kind of demonstrate how this would basically work. So we've said, here you go, 1 fireball. We emit our signals to update our script, and then that's it. And so that's the end of this long branch that starts with this question, would you like to buy a fireball for 2 apples? So let's add in one more thing where we can just have our NPC say, well, see you later. So that's kind of the end of our dialogue. Let's just move this above here. What if they don't have enough apples? So after the end branch, we can do another if, and let's put this up here. And so we'll do apple count and we'll say is less than 2. And so if the apple count is less than 2, then we'll just have our NPC say, you don't have enough apples. And so we could actually make it so that he doesn't even ask the question, but we want to tell the player that they can buy the fireball. So we're going to start the dialogue like that. There's a lot of different ways to do this. This is just one of them. And I got my nodes tangled up a little bit here. So let's drag this choice no to the bottom of this branch. Okay, so let's make sure this all lines up. So the question, choice yes, if and branch, if and branch, choice no, and then end the main branch. That looks pretty good. So let's just update our NPC code with our add fireball and remove apple code, and then we should be done. So let's go back to our script. And so this is, now we have to connect our generic signal. So we're gonna say dialog.connect. And so all of our Dialogic signals are gonna be Dialogic underscore signal, and then we use that parameter to decide what to do with it. So here we're gonna say update resources. And so let's make a new function under end dialog. We'll just call this update resources. And so this one, we're actually going to use our parameter. So let's put param here, and we can say if param equals add fireball. I don't actually have fireballs in this version, so I'm just gonna print added a fireball, just so we can see that that works. And if our param equals remove apple, then we'll remove an apple from our global item count. So we'll say global.item count minus equals 1. So we'll remove 2 apples. And so we won't be able to do this if we don't have enough apples. The last thing I wanna do is actually update my metrics. So what we'll do here is we're just gonna emit a signal for update metrics, and we'll connect that to our scene manager. So we're gonna say emit signal update metrics, and then we have to actually have that signal. So let's add one more variable up here. This is a signal update metrics. And let's go back to our scene, go to scene manager. Well, actually we're gonna have to do this from the NPC. So we'll go back to the NPC, go to our node, there's our update metrics. We're gonna connect that to our scene manager to update our metrics. And really all we have to do here is go to metrics.updateDisplay. So I'm just gonna paste that in here. Okay, I think that's everything. So let's give this a try. Okay. So if I say yes, I don't have any apples. So you don't have enough apples, that's right. And so that's the end of that conversation. Now, if we collect some apples and we go back, now we should be able to buy the fireball. So let's click yes. And here you go, 1 fireball. And you can see that my metrics were updated as well. I only have 3 apples now. So one last little thing that I forgot is that if I start the dialogue and then I leave, my players and my NPC are still talking with the talking animations. So we do have to add one last thing in the NPC script. So this end dialogue, we need to add to the on PC body exited. And so I'm going to say end dialogue here. And notice Godot is telling me I need to have a parameter here. I don't have any parameter to add to this. So I'm just going to put null here. So that's going to satisfy the requirement to be a parameter. But as we covered before, there has to be a parameter because this is a signal and it's expecting a parameter. But the underscore kind of tells us that we're not actually using the parameter. So it's just a little bit of a tricky programming thing that Godot needs to understand how this function is supposed to work. And so now we should be able to start the dialogue, but then if I walk away, then they stop talking. Of course, you could also prevent the player from walking away. So if you wanted to do something like that, you could go back to the player controller and just say in the physics process, if is alive and is moving, this will prevent the player from moving if they're in the conversation. So that's another way that you can kind of deal with this. If I go up here and now I can't actually move, that might be a better way to handle this situation. So it's a really simple system. Dialogic is a little tricky to use. As you noticed, I had to kind of move my nodes around to get everything right. We can use the folding to kind of make things bigger and smaller. And you can also do stuff like you can go from one timeline to another. So there's a lot of other options here, but I think this is a good enough intro to get started. Keep in mind, you don't have to have all of these elements. You don't have to have it in a scene like this one. You can have a whole scene that's just dialogic, and you could just add a script that just starts the dialogue and just go through the dialogue and then have a signal to go to another scene. You can also put it in a platformer scene that has gravity and all that other stuff going on. So I was just using this as an example, but you have a lot of options here. You don't have to do it exactly the way that you see it here. So let's do some documentation now that we've got all this working. So I'm going to hit play and I'm going to take a screenshot of my NPC. I'm going to go collect some apples and let's take a screenshot of that. Let's go get a screenshot of our label. And let's hit enter to start our dialogue. And we don't have to do the whole conversation here. I'm just gonna do a couple, and let's go to this one is a good one. And I think that's good enough. So let's close this, and I'm gonna go to the Open Lab and post my documentation. So on the Open Lab, I'll go to post, and I'll call this my dialogue. And we're going to look for the dialogue system and add-ons. And I'm going to say, here's a simple dialogue I created using the Dialogic plugin. And if you want to link to the font you use, I can say, here is the font that I used. And I actually got rid of that, but I think I can get it back pretty quick. So let's go here. And so I'm just going to link to the font that I used, and I can make a little link out of this. Okay. And then let's just add in our documentation. So I'm going to add these in. So here's the NPC. Here's me collecting the apples, and then the label. Beginning of the dialogue. This is kind of a long one, but that's cool. We can see this progression. And finally, the last one. So that's pretty good for some documentation. Let's preview. Okay, so I have the font if somebody wants to go look at that font that I used. And then we see starting the dialogue and then some of the dialogue. And that's a pretty good overview of everything that we added. So let's go ahead and publish.